My presentation focuses on interior spaces within German and Israeli modernism, while questioning interior structures as well as architectural implications of diaspora and world cultural heritage. And lastly, I will introduce the question of political or national identity politics in connection to shared architectural heritage. The Bauhaus school was founded by Walter Gropius in Weimar in 1919, and it revolutionized architecture and design as a college. It existed between 1919 and 1933. Then it was closed by the Nazis. So the modernist and functional architecture's interior and exterior space often cannot be separated from each other. This is visible in Hans Scharoun's house at the Weissenhof estate. Moreover, the interior space can be investigated as a concept rather than an architectural formation, because it's being shaped by its social and cultural inherent structures and contexts. So this is visible at the Weissenhof estate in Stuttgart at large, where also this house is located. This originally was built as the Werkbund exhibition site in 1927 by 27 different architects. And the buildings were representative examples of modernist ideology. So the interiors wanted to exhibit modern lifestyle alongside that. You can see here Mies van der Rohe's residential block, which consists of 24 flats, but none of them were the same. And this individuality was amongst many important statements of the Werkbund exhibition. They were promoting flexibility and individuality of the interiors, which stood in contrast to the industrial looking and more serial exteriors. An example of Bauhaus interior ideas is the Frankfurt kitchen from 1926. The Frankfurt kitchen symbolizes the new standard of rationalized thought in modernism, and it structures interior space through the floor plan and the design. So if we're asking for original intentions and cultural heritage of certain buildings, the interiors are where to look, because the interior structures are interesting signifiers of social and cultural realities of architecture, like here in the 1920s, the kitchen as a signifier of more industrial culture. So keeping in mind that the Frankfurt kitchen is an adaptable model that changed with contextualization, is it possible, for example, to translate the Frankfurt kitchen into a different culture? And for this, we will look to Tel Aviv. In Tel Aviv, with almost 4,000 buildings, the largest coherent collection of now called Bauhaus architecture can be found in form of the White City. Most of the houses were built by young European architects, as Barak has pointed out, who fled to what was then Palestine after the Nazis came to power. However, only 7 architects of those who were involved with raising the city were actually Bauhaus trained. So only 7 architects amongst all those who formed the city were Bauhaus architects. We must critically remember that. But for the outstanding cultural significance for modernist architecture, the White City was declared a World Cultural Heritage Site by UNESCO in 2003. In the White City, kitchens, which are very close in design and materiality to the Frankfurt kitchens, can be found, for example, in the Liebling house. You can see that here on the left. The original Frankfurt kitchen was, however, an answer to growing needs of social housing. And the standards of living in Tel Aviv, of the settlers in the White City, were mainly those of upper and upper middle class, because they could essentially afford to resettle to Tel Aviv. The similarities of kitchens in Germany and Tel Aviv derive from mostly functional reasons. So the quick installation and cheap materials were amongst the reasons. They did not evolve from similar societal or political needs. So it's important not to interpret references of style as simple translations. The kitchens in Tel Aviv also had alterations from the Frankfurt kitchens. For example, they had 2 sinks incorporating the Jewish daily life, and they had attached service balconies that reacted to local climatic conditions. The migration of materials and practical ideas, in case of the kitchens in Tel Aviv, should not be mistaken at any point for a mere translation of interior architecture. So rather than a translation, we should look at the aspect of migration, both of architecture and interior ideas. and then lastly of materials. Western modernist architects tried to design flexible spaces with industrial materials and serial production methods. However, Tel Aviv modernism could not draw on such infrastructure in Palestine. The local production of building materials wasn't fast enough for the construction of a whole city. So the Havara, I hope I pronounced this right, the Havara transfer agreement that the German Zionists concluded with the Nazis in 1933 allowed Jews who emigrated to Palestine to deposit their assets in German transfer banks. And this meant that Israeli importers could buy German goods and materials and gave the proceeds back to the immigrants. So with this, a lot of German goods came into the country, amongst them machines and modern and industrial building materials, which were then used in the construction of the White City. So this transfer agreement is a foundation for a shared German-Israeli material heritage and transcultural implications manifested in Tel Aviv's architecture. And the modernist interiors in Germany's and Israeli modernism are not mainly influenced by Bauhaus ideology, thus, but rather by this migration of industrial materials. Of course, there were strongly practical reasons for choosing modernist architecture to quickly erect a modern state, because the construction of modernist architecture relied on steel skeletons and industrial materials. The region around Tel Aviv was truly a melting pot in the 1940s, and settlers from all over the world gathered. So Zionists were looking for a new formal cultural expression that Jews of all cultures would agree on and that would unite them. The modernist architecture was neutral enough, so to say, to contain this multicultural complexity. It acted as a sort of carte blanche or container architecture. It was collecting and framing the diversity of Jewish culture brought to Palestine. And there were also more reasons. It was basically one of the only options that was agreed upon by all, because the immigrants of the 1940s did not want to tie in with the Arab architecture. First of all, because of cultural and political tensions, but also they wanted to manifest their very own cultural expression. And then also building in a more European style wasn't fitting, because settlers had just fled from there and wanted a fresh start. So the modernist architecture could be seen as a new style for Jewish culture, and thus a manifestation of Zionism. So now to the diasporic rooms. We must remember that this modernist style was swiftly superimposed into Israel. So for more than 20 years, a cultural discrepancy separated modernist exteriors and the interiors in Tel Aviv. Settlers from the 1930s imported their belongings and installed them within their new modernist homes. And what was resulted were diasporic rooms filled with Biedermeier furniture and German floral painted porcelain. The buildings were even altered in their design to hold large Biedermeier furniture pieces. So in the Liebling house, as we can see here too, the windows were placed higher to allow the placement of Biedermeier furniture underneath them. So the people wanted to keep their culture, and the interiors reflected this diasporic reality of the settlers. The people lived in harsh contrast to the radically modern exteriors in Tel Aviv's architecture. So not only the interior structures and furniture help us to understand the migration and local implications of architecture in Israel, but so do the colors. The White City was never really white, neither on the inside nor on the outside. The White City actually brimmed with colors, mostly in lighter shades because of the climate conditions. And it was oriented at local color schemes of yellow, beige, and terrazzo. The now white walls are rather multi-layered membranes, and upon closer look, they reveal a colorful past. The modernist style in Israel was intended to bridge the cultural differences of all Jews who immigrated to Palestine. However, narrating it as a white city and a Western-centric story alone leaves out a very complex history and site-specific Arab influences. We will now turn to the present. So the White City can be considered as a monumental architectural conglomerate. It is a shared cultural, or rather a world cultural heritage, And treating the buildings as monuments alone doesn't suffice, because the Tel Aviv, or the White City, needs to be reacted to from a perspective of both renovation as a monument, and also that of development to ensure contemporary living spaces. So the white facades might look like they are true to modernist features inside out, but the needs of the inhabitants have definitely changed. So this sometimes leads to vast remodelings of interior space, for example, through technological innovations such as climate control or elevators. When they are built in, the floor plans undergo radical interference. So the outside actually might still look originally modernism, but the inside has changed dramatically. So when dealing with architectural heritage that is still used as more than a just museum, it is vital to consider not only the facades, the exteriors, but also the interiors, because the interiors negotiate the multiple narratives and traces of cultural heritage on the inside of the buildings. Interiors pose a unique opportunity to question the site-specific reality of architecture, and also architecture's dialogue with its multiple historicities. So it shouldn't be treated by museum standards of preservation. It's rather an opportunity to investigate shared cultural heritage through its history of interior structure and the narratives of the inhabitants. And especially in Tel Aviv, houses call for frequent renovations due to the, on the one side, climate context, but also the lack of residential space in this fast-growing metropolis. So the houses have to be protected against earthquakes. So this includes also rocket-proof spaces and the adding of bunker rooms. But then also interventions include adding whole new stories to the buildings. So for example, in the cases of these modernist buildings in Tel Aviv, whole new floors were added to the initial modernist buildings, which makes some German monument architects shiver, because it's not a very German approach. However, in Tel Aviv, the modernism cannot retreat into being a museum. The architecture is always a container for something and serves the purpose to host its interiors. Tel Aviv's modernism showcases a highly individualized adaptation to the site-specific cultural and climate-related needs. And it showed the development of a very unique and local expression with modernism, including some Arab elements, including the climate conditions. It was made very clear that the Bauhaus term often is used uncritically as a synonym for modern architecture. However, Bauhaus must be seen and understood as a distinct cultural orientation of modernism, and it is not representative of the international dimensions of the modern movement in Tel Aviv. And looking into the buildings, the climate-inspired floor plans and the diasporic rooms should have proven that. But then why is Bauhaus still the dominant term when talking modernism? And one of the reasons for this is that Bauhaus is an important term for national identity politics, foremost in Germany, but also with growing importance of the White City in Israel. And furthermore, obviously, Israel has a young national identity, so cultural heritage that is in such a way manifested as a White City is very important for them and their national identity. To conclude, here's what my research circled in short. The assumed neutrality of modernists, and particularly Bauhaus denoted white walls, must be critically questioned. Multiple historicities lay within and behind those walls. Interior formations contain the social and cultural implications of architectural heritage and document transcultural shifts, and therefore are important signifiers of this cultural heritage. Shared heritage as a concept alone is not capable of describing the historical and current socio-political negotiation inscribed in modernism, as well as its site-specific and cultural implications. And also, modernism is never simply international, but it's often specifically culturally site-specific, which must be considered. And then lastly, world cultural heritage and its promotion must be informed by academic discourse rather than political interest in order to secure its claims. And lastly, here are some sources and a bibliography. That's for my presentation. Thank you.